know if it's the fact that God's stretching me or if he's just showing that he has a really good sense of humor, or both. You can be the judge of that when we're all done, I guess. Um, Before we start, though, I'm going to ask the Lord to be with us this morning. Like I said, this is really stretching, so we'll see how this goes this morning. And Father, we thank you so much for your faithfulness. Father, we thank you for your word. And Lord, let it be your word that comes forth. Just let me be the conduit for you to use. And I just give it all to you in the name of Jesus. Amen. You know, so many things have been going through my mind, and which is not unusual. But it was a matter of, God, you're going to have to take all of this out there and channel it and put it together. So I just pray that the things that are in my heart will make sense to you, because up here they make a lot of sense. So I want to make sure that they do as I talk with you this morning. And you know, Mother's Day was a day initiated by the greeting card company. Surprise. But you know, God made women special. And Mother's Day can be a very difficult day. There's a lot of hoopla, there's a lot of celebration, but there's a lot of memories. There's a lot of old sorrows. There are a lot of things that maybe we're mothers, maybe we're not. Maybe we have been and we're not now on the earthly realm. Maybe our life hasn't gone the way that we wanted to, but God has made us all to be women of God. And that's more what I want to talk to you about this morning. Because throughout the scriptures, God used mothers, but he used women first and foremost. And so, even though this is a special day with motherhood, and we're going to look at that too, but I want to talk about women of God, because that's what we all are. And if I focus on the women, men, hang in there. Your day comes next month, okay? So I'm not trying to exclude you from the virtues that we're extolling today, but it's our turn. You get your turn in June. And you know, motherhood looks different for every woman. You know, we get this textbook idea, years ago, people of my age, you know, the married woman, White House, picket fence, 2 kids, a dog and a cat. She stayed home, you know, looked like June Cleaver and everything. That was a fairy tale, and I'm not sure where that came from. Because as women, we're very bad about comparisons. And if we see something that is supposed to be the model, we tend to compare ourselves to those things, and we are cruel to ourselves. We beat ourselves up worse than anybody if there's something that we think we don't measure up to. But you know, every woman's different. When we've got blended families. We have women with children, women without children. We have divorced women, single women. Women with 1 child or 10, although I can't imagine that. But, you know, when I was a kid growing up, and if you've been in churches long enough, they used to do these different things for Mother's Day. The mother with the youngest child, the mother with the oldest child, and they would have a little gift for them. The mother with the most children present. Well, I would have won that today. We had our church I grew up in, bless her heart, we had one large family, and she had the honoriest kids in the world, but you always knew they'd be in church on Mother's Day because she wanted to win. But everybody's families are different, just as women and the men too. We're all different, and that's a good thing. God made us that way. And you know, if you have not been one to actually wear the title of mother, God has still placed on you a responsibility. My responsibility is not just to my children. It's to every child I come in contact with. And I'm in a position now at work where I come in contact with a lot of kids. And it's probably good for some of them that I'm not their mother, because I would handle things a lot differently. But there are also those kids who come through my doors and sit in front of my desk that I pray for them at night because I see what they're going through. God put you where you are Mothering is an action. And just because you don't wear that title, you're not excused. And if you do have that title, you're really not excused. God has a reason for you to be where you are. And you know, especially more as crazy as this world is, I mean, there's only one word to describe it, and it's stupid. And I don't do stupid well. Who ever thought in our lifetime we would be in a position where we're trying to have to explain to people what a woman is? There was a gentleman by the name, I think it was it Matt Walsh, that did a video, went around the United States, and he asked people, what is a woman? You never saw such foolish answers and confusion out of people. Everything's gone crazy. And you know, that puts even more of a responsibility on a godly Christian woman. God's depending on us to show young women, young mothers, what a woman is, the way God intended. Genesis tells us how God created Adam, and he noticed that it wasn't good for Adam to be alone. He needed a helper. How many women know your men need a helper? So do we. So God took a rib from Adam, and he created Eve. She may have been made from Adam, but she wasn't Adam. She was a totally separate individual, placed in life for a specific job, category, fulfillment of God's word for what women should be. Genesis 1:27 tells us that God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female. They come in two, male and female. But you know, I got to looking and I thought, what was it like for women during the days of the Bible? And ladies, if you haven't had a chance to read it, there's a book that came out a couple years ago by a lady by the name of Shannon Bream called Women of the Bible Speak. It is so good, and it shares so much. These were real women. Because they're in a book, their stories are written down, and we can see the end result of how God moved in their life. It doesn't change the struggles that they had every single day. And it's a real eye-opener, and I would encourage you to read that. But it made me wonder what what life for women in general was like during that time. One of the ministers I was reading some notes on said he honestly believed that women had it easier then than they do now. And of course I'm thinking, I don't know about that. But what he was talking about was the fact that women knew what women were. They knew their responsibilities. They knew the role that God had created for them. They didn't have to sit and wonder, well, should I also be doing this? Should I be doing this? Am I supposed to be this for that person? Their roles were very well defined, and some things made it easier for them. Although the actual labors of going through the day were far from that. Most of the roles were defined because of the physiology of women. They birthed the children, they nurtured them and while they were small specifically. And God created men to be stronger. They're to be our protector and our supporter. That doesn't mean we're inferior because we're different. Doesn't mean they're inferior because they're different. We each have a role that God gave for us to fill, and we're dependent upon each other. And just because we may be physically weaker and they're physically stronger, that does not make us inferior. That makes us who we are. I listened to a gentleman who does marriage counseling, and he was talking about some of the things he had encountered with couples. And he said, you know, they can't understand, the man can't understand why she doesn't act more like him, and she can't understand why he doesn't act more like her. And he looked at them and he said, if you're alike, one of you is unnecessary. And I don't know about you, but I don't want a carbon copy of me. And I know my kids don't want a carbon copy of me. There's a phrase that was often used, according to some studies I found, some information I found. women were basically under the control of their father. Once they were born, they were cared for, their lives were dictated. Any decisions made were made by their father on their behalf. Even their marriages, a lot of times where their father got with someone else's father and said, this is going to be your spouse. And then when they left the home of their father, their husband assumed that role and took it over. But one of the phrases that really got to me, it's in the Old Testament era especially, it's, I thank God I am not a Samaritan or a woman. And you know what they thought of Samaritans? You know, their lot in life they thought was a lot better. And God made distinctions between us. But in Galatians 3, it tells us that we're still equal in the eyes of God. There's no male and female. There's no Jew and Gentile. He doesn't love one over the other. He sees us for who we are, and he loves us for who we are. He set us apart, ladies, for special honor. Husbands are commanded to love their wives, just as Christ loved the church, even to the point of giving their lives for them, just as Christ did for us. And I know there's some verses ahead of that that deal with submission, and men, you can talk about that next month. So, but we each are there for the other person in that relationship. And you know, even though the roles of the women were more clearly defined, women's lives were very, very difficult. They were responsible for the household. Not only did they have to sew the children's clothing or the robes that their families wore, a lot of times they had to even weave the cloth. Especially a woman with lower income. She didn't have the luxury of going to the market and buying these beautiful fabrics. There was flax and linen that was very coarse, and a lot of times they had to make that into a wearable thread so that then they could decide what to clothe their children and their husbands in. They typically had the most control over the household's material things because the women were in charge of the home. The men took care of things outside of the home, made provisions so that the woman could care for the home. They typically were the ones who named the children more than the fathers did. But then when you think about it, God went to Mary and told her what to name her child. God went to Hagar and told her what to name her child. Most of the women were most likely to be the medical specialists. They were the ones who took care of injuries and definitely were specifically the midwives to assist during childbirth. Most of the social, political, and religious institutions excluded women. While they had all this responsibility at home, they were very limited outside that home. Even in the temple, if you look, there was a woman's section of the temple and a men's section of the temple. They were in a position to where when they worshiped at a gate further away from the men. But yet at the same time, they were typically the ones who prepared the incense and the grain offerings for the temple worship. They were the ones responsible for the musical performances during the times of celebration. Just like when we look in the New Testament where John the Baptist wound up eventually losing his head. It was Herodias' daughter was doing the performing there in front of the king. But yet at the same time, some of the women were prophets too. You look at Deborah and you look at Miriam. God had roles for them, but he didn't put them in a box and say, you stay here, this is the only place you can be. Anything you do is right within these little parameters. I want to read some scripture to you. It's kind of lengthy, and we're going to look at Proverbs 31. Steve's going to pull that up here for us. Because we can't talk about women. I used to not have a lot of like for this because I thought there is no way in the world this woman makes me tired just reading what she does. Till I looked a little more in depth about it. First of all, let's look at verse 10. A wife of noble character Who can find? Does that mean she doesn't exist? Maybe she's not the one we're supposed to be just exactly like? She's worth far more than rubies. Her husband has full confidence in her and lacks nothing of value. She brings him good, not harm, all the days of her life. She selects wool and flax and works eagerly with her hands. So here she is making cloth for her family. She's like the merchant ships bringing food from far away. She gets up while it is still night, and she provides food for her family and portions for her female servants. Her work begins. A woman's work often begins before the rest of the household, doesn't it? She considers a field and buys it. Out of her earnings, she plants a vineyard. She was also an entrepreneur. She sets about her work vigorously. Her arms are strong for her tasks. She sees that her trading is profitable, and her lamp does not go out at night. I don't know about you, but these started bringing pictures to my mind. The times that the kids needed something the next day for school, or the night before, the Sunday before Christmas, when they all had to have new dresses and you're sitting at the sewing machine trying to get them finished at the 11th hour. She was up late at night taking care of things. In her hand, she holds the distaff and grasps the spindle with her fingers. She opens her arms to the poor and extends her hands to the needy. She's a compassionate woman, not just for her own family, but for people around her. She sees the needs and tries to meet those. When it snows, she has no fear for her household, for all of them are clothed in scarlet. This is a woman who plans ahead. She doesn't get up to see, okay, what's today? What do I need to take care of? She looks ahead to the needs of her family to meet those. She makes coverings for her bed, and she is clothed in fine linen and purple. She's a woman who cares for her appearance. She may be wealthy if she's wearing purple. This particular woman. Her husband is respected at the city gate, where he takes his seat among the elders of the land. She makes linen garments and sells them, and supplies the merchants with sashes. This is a working woman. She is clothed with strength and dignity. She can laugh at the days to come. This is a woman who's placed her faith in her God, and she has done her part, and she doesn't fear for what's coming ahead. She speaks with wisdom, and faithful instruction is on her tongue. How many of you have shared stories of sitting with your mom or a grandmother and them sharing Bible stories or sharing the word with you? You will never, ever know what seeds you sow in children, whether they're yours or someone else's, when you share Jesus with them. She watches over the affairs of her household and does not eat the bread of idleness. Her children arise and call her blessed, her husband also, and he praises her. Many women do noble things, but you surpass them all. This does not say that this woman is the greatest woman in the whole world, but it says her husband believes she is. The other man's husband believed his wife was. That's all that matters. Charm is deceptive and beauty is fleeting, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised. Honor her for all that her hands have done, and let her works bring her praise at the city gates. This is not a laundry list of tasks. This is not something that says, okay, son, when you go marry a woman, she has to do this, she has to do this, she has to do this, she has to do this. This was actually an acrostic that a man presented to his son on the qualities of a woman that he would marry. Not on the tasks, but on her qualities. All of her talents were practical. She exhibits overwhelming wisdom. She's uncommon, and she's special and very precious. Her worth to her husband has no price tag. She is skilled, creative, and very task-oriented. She enjoys her accomplishments. She exhibits compassion and kindness. She looks ahead to anticipate her family's need. She is a mother and that guides her children, and her hands are never idle. I think a woman's hands tell a lot. Ladies, look at your hands. Don't hide them. Hold them up there and look at them. What do you see? If you're like me, I see some arthritis. I see some scars. I see a cut from the foil container from yesterday. I see a lot of wrinkles and spots. But these are the hands that have loved my family. Yours are the hands that love your family. Just before my mother passed away a few years ago, my oldest daughter took a picture, and it is one of the most precious things I have. It was my mother's hand, my hand, Amy's hand, and Addie's hand, and they told a whole life story. My mother's hands were she was in her 80s, so you can imagine what they look like. But those are the hands that dried my tears. They're also the ones that smacked my behind a couple times. The ones that went to work to help provide for her family to supplement my father's income. The ones who touched my cheek and told me she loved me. Then there were mine, kind of on the way to that. Didn't have as many accolades as hers did. My daughters, hers didn't look old, but they were in the early stages. They will be in time, Amy, sorry. And then Addie still had the innocent, little pudgy child's hands, a little bit of that left. You know, at the beginning of her journey, your hands are special. And just like the woman in Proverbs, honor her for all her hands have done. If we look in Matthew chapter 1, we see a lineage of men. I'm going to kind of go off a little bit different path here, just a little bit. In a world dominated by men, we see the lineage, the genealogy of Jesus. Genealogies are really important. David, in recent years, has done so much research in genealogy, and they're so interesting. And you know, if you look in everybody's genealogy, there's some people there, and we've all got them. Maybe you don't want to acknowledge it or not, but we've all got some things in our background and some people. That's just the way it is. I grew up thinking my godly grandfather had been a godly man his whole life. I was in my 30s before I found out that Pawpaw used to run moonshine. So everybody's got people and situations in their past. But in a male-dominated world, the genealogy of Christ lists 3 women. The first is a woman by the name of Tamar. She was a daughter-in-law of Judah. She married one of Judah's sons, and he died. So as the custom would have it in those days, the women would marry a brother to produce an heir for the deceased son. So she married another brother. She didn't have any children with him either, and he died. So she did some conniving and presented herself as a prostitute to have a child by her father-in-law. But what she learned in life and the character that she developed after that, God thought was important enough to list her as one of Jesus' ancestors. Rahab was a prostitute. But if you read her story, she had heard the acclaim from far and wide of how the God of the Israelites was different. He was guiding them. They were conquering wherever they went. And this woman sheltered the spies and had a part in them taking over Jericho. She became the mother of Boaz. And who did Boaz marry? Ruth. She was not even a Jewish woman. But yet, she got a whole book in the Bible because of her dedication to the family, to her family, and to their God. And God used her, and she became the third woman listed in the lineage of Jesus. He doesn't care what your background is. This book is full of nothing but messed up people, except for one. They didn't stay that way, but they had flaws. Some of them were really big. Some of them not so obvious. But God did something in them. And that says everything for us. It doesn't matter what flaws we've had. It doesn't matter what dumb choices we've made. God sees more. He sees what we are through him. And there's one woman I want to talk with you about here for just a few minutes. We're going to look at Genesis chapter 16. And this may be kind of an unusual woman to look at on Mother's Day. But she had quite the story. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. But he had an Egyptian slave named Hagar. So she said to Adam, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her." Abram agreed to what Sarai said. So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarai, his wife, took her Egyptian slave Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with her and she conceived. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. Then Sarai said to Abraham, "You are responsible for the wrong I'm suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now she knows she's pregnant and she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me." "Your slave is in your hands," Abram said. "Do with her whatever you think best." Then Sarai mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was the spring that is beside the road to Shur. And he said, "Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going?" "I'm running away from my mistress Sarai," she answered. Then the angel of the Lord told her, "Go back to your mistress and submit to her." The angel added, "I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count." The angel of the Lord also said to her, "You are now pregnant and you will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. He will live in hostility toward all his brothers." She gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. "You are the God who sees me," for she said, "I have now seen the one who sees me." That is why the well called Bir Lahai Roi is still there between Kadesh and Bered. So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram gave the name Ishmael to the son she had born. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar was born. We don't know how old Hagar was when this started, but we do know that she was an Egyptian slave. She was probably purchased on their travels. She was to serve Sarah. And at first reading you think, man, but within the custom of those days, it was common for a woman who could not bear children to have children through her handmaiden. We see it with Rebecca or Rachel and Leah. So Sarah, even though God had told her that they would have a child, told Abraham just a short time before this, almost the same words. You're going to have a child, and your descendants are going to be like the sand by the seashore. You won't be able to count them all. But there was no child. Until Sarah decided, well, maybe we need to do it this way and not that way. She took matters into her own hands, and we give her a lot of grief for that. But one of the things I looked at through here, ladies, we talk about that virtuous woman and all her wonderful characteristics, but we know there's another side to women. Have you ever worked in an office full of women? They probably got along as well as these two women sometimes. Sarah came up with the idea, this will be the child of promise because I'm going to go about it this way because God's not doing anything, so obviously it's up to me to take care of it. How many times have you been in that situation, maybe without realizing it? You pray and you wait on God to do something, but you get tired of waiting and you think, I'll just take care of it myself. And it messes things up every single time. God did make Ishmael's descendants a big problem. And the cousins have been fighting through the centuries. And we're still dealing with it. Some of the choices you make have long, long repercussions. But the whole point of being a slave, they had jobs to do. They had responsibilities. But in a lot of ways, they were to be invisible. They just went around, did what they were supposed to do. They were not family. They were below second-class citizens. You do what you need to do, and if I have something that's supposed to be here, you make sure it's there, but I don't necessarily want to see you do it. They're invisible. They're less than people. So here Hagar is expecting a child. And she can't take it because Sarah's starting to regret her decision. And she's treating her terribly. She can't handle it anymore. She said, I've got to get out of here. Do you know the first time the Bible mentions the angel of the Lord appearing was to Hagar, a young slave who wasn't even Jewish. God saw her. He didn't just notice her. He saw her. He saw the hurt. He saw the problems that she was bearing. He saw her sorrow. He saw Hagar, a young Egyptian slave. But even though God saw her, he didn't take her out of that situation. I'm sure having the angel of the Lord appear was phenomenal, but what does he do? He doesn't save me from my problems. He tells me, go back. Serve those people that have been terrible to you. And we may find there's times that we're in situations, especially as women, dealing with people, dealing with situations at home where we just can't take it. We've just got to get out. We've got to have a break. And God quickens our heart and says, okay, now go back. That may not be what we want to hear, but God's got a reason. He's got a plan. So Hagar goes back. She has her son, and it may have given her a little bit more standing in their tribal community, but it may not have. She was still a slave, even though she had borne the master's child. And it was 14 years before Isaac came along. Sarah had to wait a long time after her choices. But instead of things getting better, now Sarah's got her child, and there's that woman and her kid. And the fight starts. You got women going head to head. It gets ugly. None of us know what that's like. So Sarah's had enough, and Abraham's probably tired of listening to it. He's had enough. He says, look, you do what you want to do. They give her some supplies, and they send her and her child out in the desert. She was going to die. The child was going to die. There was no water. And guess who shows up? Guess who shows up? The same God who made a covenant with Abraham just a few verses back came and made, not necessarily a child of covenant, but made a promise to Hagar. He saw her. He asked her. He told her what he was going to do. He was going to make her children numerous. But you know, the point I'm trying to make is, when we go through life, ladies, when you're sitting up late and you've got a sick child with a horrible cough and a high fever, mine were young at a time we didn't have urgent care to go to. You had to call the doctor in the middle of the night, and they'd say, well, just see how they do in the morning. And you're holding them, and it doesn't seem to be getting any better. God sees you. He saw Hagar. He didn't just see a person sitting there. It's like the difference between hearing someone and listening. God saw her. For the first time in her life, she was not an invisible slave. He saw her for who she was. When you spend time and you're wondering, how in the world am I going to make the finances stretch this month or this year? God sees you right where you are. Ladies, you've all been there, and there's times when you're taking care of this, and this, and you feel like, what about me? I'm kind of getting lost in all of this. What about Karen? Karen's still a person. God sees. And he doesn't just see, he hears, he listens, he meets you where you are. When life gets too stinking heavy sometimes, and if it hasn't, hang on, at some time it will. I can guarantee it. That's what life is. But God sees. Ivy, God sees you. He sees that road you're walking. And not only does he see you, he cares, he loves you, and he's walking it with you. Carmen, God sees you. He sees the times that you're up there, holding Larry's hand, helping him, encouraging him, praying when he may not know it, for healing and strength and recovery. But God sees you. He sees every one of us, no matter what we're going through. And if you get nothing out of anything I've said, I want you to remember, he sees you. He sees your situation. He sees your circumstances. How do I know? He did it for Hagar. And there's been time in my life when I know God saw me. So this Mother's Day, as you spend time with those wonderful kids and wonderful family members, you also know there's times that you're really thankful for this day, because there's a lot of times it's not always so wonderful. It's hard. It's hard being a caregiver in any way, shape, or form. It's hard being a parent. But just remember, God sees you. He sees that child, and he meets those needs. He comes to where you are for you. We sing that song a lot of times, The Goodness of God. That song gets me every time, because there's things in there that are so true. And I like that second verse. He says, I love your voice. You've led me through the fire. In darkest nights, you're close like no other. I've known you as a father. I've known you as a friend. And I have lived in the goodness of God. Every one of you can say that. Every one of you can say that. Because we have a God who sees us, who meets us, and is there in our time of need. And he loves you more than those kids that make those wonderful Mother's Day gifts and all those little things. He loves you even more than that. Be thankful today for him, for the people he's put in your life. Pastor.